dropping a tray of champagne flutes in the penthouse of a man who'd had 3 rivals disappeared last spring usually ended one way. For Penny Malone, it ended with a job offer. The Voss Grand wasn't the kind of hotel where girls like Penny Malone worked. It was the kind of hotel where girls like Penny Malone pressed their noses to the revolving glass doors and fogged them up from the outside. 42 floors of black marble and brushed gold in the middle of Chicago's Magnificent Mile, it catered to foreign dignitaries, tech billionaires, and one particular permanent resident who occupied the entire top floor and whose name the staff only spoke in whispers. Ravil Sorin. Penny had heard the name exactly once before she started, from the woman at the temp agency who slid a non-disclosure agreement across the desk before Penny had even signed her W-9. The Voss has a private banquet service on 42, the woman had said, her voice flat and careful, the way people speak around things they don't want to touch directly. The resident requires discretion. Penny had nodded like she understood. She didn't. She needed the money. Her mother's dialysis wasn't going to pay for itself, and the diner on Wabash, where she'd been waitressing for 4 years, had closed its doors on a Thursday with a padlock and a handwritten note from the bank. She'd signed the NDA without reading past the second paragraph. At 26, broke and cornered, discretion seemed like a small price. She was not a small woman. 5'4", 268 pounds of soft Irish-Polish curves that no uniform in the hotel's standard inventory had ever been designed to accommodate. The head of banquet services, a rigid Frenchman named Thibault, who had the energy of a man perpetually offended by the existence of carbohydrates, had looked at her during orientation with an expression that stopped just short of being actionable. "The jacket," he'd said, "it will have to be managed." Penny had managed it with a safety pin at the back seam, which she was 90% confident was holding, and 0% confident would survive a full shift. She'd been assigned to the private floor for 2 weeks without ever seeing its resident. The work was simple enough. Set the table before 7, clear it by 9, keep her eyes down, her footsteps quiet, and under no circumstances speak to the man unless spoken to. The other staff on rotation had refined their movements to something almost surgical. They glided, they materialized, they dematerialized. They were, Penny observed, essentially ghosts in pressed white jackets. Penny was not a ghost. Penny was a woman who apologized to door frames she walked into, which happened more than she would ever voluntarily admit. The night everything changed was a Wednesday in February, which is the ugliest month Chicago produces. All gray slush and wind that comes off the lake like a personal insult. There was a private dinner. 8 guests. Thibault had informed the staff with the gravity of a man announcing a military operation. "Mr. Sorin's associates from overseas. You will be invisible. You will be silent. You will not exist." Penny had been positioned near the service entrance with a tray of crystal champagne flutes, freshly filled, catching the light from the chandelier above like a row of small fires. She'd held the tray for 11 minutes without incident, which was, in retrospect, her longest streak of the evening. It was the rug. It was always the rug. The edge of the hand-knotted silk carpet curled by approximately 4 millimeters at its northeast corner. 4 millimeters was not enough for any reasonable person to worry about. It was exactly enough for Penny Malone's sensible black flat to catch, sending 268 pounds of momentum pitching forward with the slow, horrifying inevitability of a falling sequoia. The tray left her hands. The flutes did not scatter so much as they detonated, a crystalline explosion across the white tablecloth, the floor, and the lapels of 3 men in suits that probably cost more than Penny's mother's monthly treatment. Champagne soaked the centerpiece. 1 glass rolled to the edge of the table and fell directly into the lap of the man at the head of it. Ravil Sorin did not flinch. He was not what Penny had constructed in her imagination over 2 weeks of third-floor gossip and careful avoidance. She'd expected someone visibly monstrous, the kind of face that looked like it had been assembled from components of cruelty. Instead, he was somewhere north of 40, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, with a jaw like a shelf and eyes the color of deep water on an overcast day. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, his collar open, and he sat at the head of his table with the complete physical stillness of a man who has never once in his life been startled. He looked down at the champagne spreading across his trousers. He looked at the wreckage of 12 crystal flutes. He looked at Penny, who was on her hands and knees on the silk rug, surrounded by glittering shards. Her face the approximate color of a stop sign. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice coming out strange and high and completely failing to convey the depth of how sorry she was. "I will pay for everything. I can do installments. I don't know what these cost, but I can absolutely do installments." The 8 men around the table were very still. 2 of them, Penny noticed from the floor, had their hands below the table in a way that did not suggest they were adjusting their napkins. Ravil Sorin tilted his head exactly 1 degree. "Get up," he said. His voice was low, accented faintly, unhurried. Penny got up. She was bleeding slightly from one palm where a shard had caught her, and she pressed it against her jacket without thinking, and then immediately thought about the dry cleaning bill for the jacket, and then immediately remembered the jacket wasn't hers, and then decided this entire line of thinking was something she could have at a more appropriate moment, which was not this one. She stood in front of the most dangerous man in the room, she would later understand, probably the city, with champagne on his trousers and glass in her hair, and met his gaze because she had nowhere else to look. "I have a condition," she said, because apparently she was incapable of silence when frightened. "Proprioceptive processing disorder. It's neurological." "I have documentation." She did not have documentation. She did not have a proprioceptive processing disorder. She had, by the informal diagnosis of 3 separate physical therapists, simply an extraordinarily poor relationship with spatial awareness. But it had sounded better in the moment. Ravil Sorin looked at her for a long 3 seconds. "Thibault," he said, without turning his head. Thibault materialized from the service entrance, white-faced. "Mr. Sorin, I sincerely apologize. This will not." "She stays." Ravil picked up his remaining dinner fork and turned back to his plate. "Have someone bring more glasses and a bandage." Conversation resumed. Penny stood there for another 4 seconds before Thibault's hand closed around her kitchen with the grip of a man containing his own coronary event. "What did you say to him?" Thibault hissed. "I told him I have a neurological condition." Thibault stared at her. "Do you?" "I have very bad luck," Penny said, which was true and in some ways more accurate. She survived the rest of the evening by staying close to the walls and not holding anything taller than a bread plate. When the guests finally filtered out just after midnight, she began the quiet work of clearing the table alone, the rest of the staff having dispersed. She was stacking the dessert plates when she became aware that she was no longer alone. Ravil Sorin stood in the doorway to the dining room, jacket removed now, his sleeves rolled to the forearm. He was holding a glass of something amber, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're still here," he said. "I'm finishing the table." She set down a plate. "I break things. I don't leave messes." A beat of silence. "How long have you been on rotation up here?" 2 weeks. "I don't remember seeing you. You weren't meant to." She glanced at him. That was the instruction. He considered this. "What's your name?" "Penny Malone. Penny Malone." He repeated it, the way people sometimes do when they're deciding whether to file something away. "You're not afraid of me." She opened her mouth to say something brave and self-possessed, and instead heard herself say, "I'm absolutely terrified of you. I'm just also in a lot of trouble for the glasses, and I'm trying to prioritize." The corner of his mouth moved. It was barely anything, a half-degree shift in an otherwise composed face. But Thibault, who had appeared silently in the doorway behind him and witnessed it, would later tell the kitchen manager it was the first time in 2 years of employment that he had seen Ravil Sorin react to anything with something other than cool assessment. He left without another word. Penny finished the table, took the service elevator down, sat in her car in the parking structure for approximately 6 minutes, and then drove home and did not tell her mother anything about the evening except that the tips had been good. She was called back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. By the 4th week, Penny had developed what she privately thought of as a damage catalogue. One additional glass, a gravy boat that had slid off a serving cart during a minor earthquake she maintained, was not her fault, and a very expensive orchid centerpiece that had toppled when she'd reached past it and misjudged the clearance by approximately 1 inch. The orchid had been caught by one of Ravil's men, a broad-shouldered Russian named Gennady, who had the neck of a water heater and who now watched her with the focused attention of a man assigned to a wildlife habitat. She'd started to learn the rhythms of the floor, the men who came and went, the way the energy in the room shifted when Ravil walked in, that specific silence that preceded him, the calls he took in the study with the door almost but never fully closed, the voice inside dropping to a register she felt more than heard. She understood now, with a clarity she'd been postponing for weeks, that Moretti Logistics and Voss Grand and whatever name Ravil Sorin gave his legitimate businesses were not the point. They were the frame around something much older and more dangerous. She should have quit. Every sensible thing she owned told her to quit. She didn't quit. The pay was exceptional, the schedule was consistent, and once, on a Tuesday that had nothing to do with a scheduled shift, she'd taken the service elevator up with a replacement for the orchid she'd destroyed, because she'd found one that matched at a flower market on Milwaukee Avenue, and it had cost her $40 she didn't have. She'd set it on the table, straightened it, and was turning to leave when she'd found Ravil standing in the room. He'd looked at the orchid, then at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I knocked it over." She shrugged, pulling her tote onto her shoulder. "I replace what I break." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Sit down, Penny Malone." She'd sat. He'd poured coffee. They'd talked for 40 minutes about nothing that mattered. The weather, the best pierogi on the north side, whether the Chicago River had ever been genuinely clean or if that was a myth, and it was the most disorienting 40 minutes of her life. Sitting across a low table from a man who moved governments and disappeared people, discussing the relative merits of 2 different Polish delis in Avondale. She'd walked home in the February cold, with her cheeks warm, and her heart making choices her common sense hadn't approved. The men on the floor noticed. Gennady had started holding the service elevator for her. A younger one called Pasha, who couldn't have been older than 25, and had the edgy energy of someone waiting for something to happen, had begun leaving small chocolate squares on the tray cart before her shift. She didn't know where they came from. She ate them anyway. Ravil said nothing, but a cashmere throw appeared on the chair by the service station where she sometimes sat to rest her feet between courses. No one mentioned it. She used it every shift after that. She was 3 weeks into this new arrangement, which she hadn't named to herself and was not planning to. When she walked into the middle of something she wasn't supposed to see. It was a Thursday. She'd come up for a delivery of paperwork that Thibault had asked her to drop at the private floor reception desk, a simple errand, 5 minutes at most. She stepped off the elevator and heard voices she didn't recognize, 2 of them, speaking in a language she didn't know, coming from the sitting room with its doors pushed open. She turned to go. Too late. One of the men saw her. He was younger than Ravil, expensively dressed, with the smile of someone who'd learned early that a smile could be used as a tool for something other than warmth. He said something to his companion and then switched to English. "You must be the girl Ravil keeps up here." His gaze moved over her in the particular way that made her want to occupy less space, which was something she'd been trying to stop doing. "I heard about you, the clumsy one." He laughed, short and dismissive. "He's sentimental. He always was. A weakness." Penny stood very still. The paperwork was in her hands. The elevator was 12 feet behind her. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "Of course not." The man tilted his head. "Tell me, does he know you've seen the shipment schedule? The one printed in the binder you reorganized last month." She had reorganized a binder. She reorganized everything. It was one of the few reliable skills she brought to a room without incident. She had not read the shipment schedule because the shipment schedule had been in a language she didn't read. "I don't speak Russian," she said. The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in Russian to his companion, and they both laughed, and she understood without translation that she had not said the right thing. His name, she would learn later, was Ilya Marchenko. He ran a rival operation out of Detroit and had been trying to absorb Ravil Sorin's Chicago network for 18 months by means that ranged from financial to the kind that didn't get discussed in business terms. He had been in the Voss Grand for 6 hours, ostensibly for a meeting, and he had just identified something useful. Her phone was taken. Her bag was taken. She was walked, not roughly, but with a firmness that left no room for interpretation, through a service corridor she hadn't known existed, down 2 flights, and into a loading dock that smelled of exhaust and cold concrete, where a black car was waiting. She did not scream. She thought about it. The man's hand was on her arm and there were 2 others, and she was very aware, with a clarity that surprised her, that screaming was not the best option available. She was also aware, in the same strange bright compartment of her brain, that she was wearing her good flats, the ones with the slightly better grip, which was either irrelevant or the only thing that was going to matter. The car drove for 22 minutes. She counted. The building they brought her to was somewhere in the western neighborhoods, industrial, the kind of space that had been a manufacturing floor once and had since become something less defined. It was cold. There were overhead lights on metal chains and a chair in the center of the open floor that was not there by coincidence. Marchenko sat across from her with the patience of a man who had done this before. "Sorin values you," he said. "That makes you valuable to me." "I'm a hotel waitress," Penny said. "He valued me because I stopped knocking things over as often. That's the entire story. Call it what you want." Marchenko pulled out a phone. "He'll trade for you, and what he trades will settle a very old debt." He dialed. She heard it ring once, twice. Then Ravil's voice came through the speaker, and whatever temperature was left in the room dropped another 10 degrees. "Marchenko, I have something of yours." Marchenko smiled at Penny as he spoke. "Your little waitress. She's unharmed, if you're cooperative about the lakeshore arrangement." A pause, very brief, then, "Put her on." Marchenko held the phone out. Penny leaned forward. "I'm okay," she said. "Don't give him anything. I know you've been working on the lakeshore thing for 2 years, and I know what it means. And I am sitting in a chair in what I believe is the former Carver Foundry building on Pulaski, based on the smell of old iron and the train line I could hear, and I am going to be fine." Complete silence from the phone. "Penny," Ravil said, and his voice was different, stripped of something, the smooth surface gone. "Are you hurt?" "My wrist hurts a little from where someone grabbed it too hard, but I've had worse from the corner of a serving cart." She looked at Marchenko, who was staring at her. "Go get him. I'll be here." Marchenko took the phone back. His smile had thinned. "Brave girl," he said. "Foolish, but brave." "I'm not brave," Penny said honestly. "I'm just very bad at silence when I'm nervous." She assessed the chair while Marchenko conferred with his men near the far wall. It was metal, which was less useful than wood. Her hands were zip-tied in front of her, which was slightly more useful than behind. She was thinking about the geometry of the space, the distance to the side door she'd seen when they brought her in. When the man posted nearest to her shifted his weight and turned toward a noise from the far side of the building. It was not a large noise. It was, in fact, the very specific sound of something being knocked over in the dark, followed by a quietly hissed profanity in what she thought was English. Then the side door exploded inward. It was not a dramatic explosion. It was a door meeting a considerable amount of force applied by several large men moving fast. Gennady came through first, which made sense because Gennady was the size of a residential refrigerator. Pasha came through second. 3 more followed. Ravil Sorin came through last. He'd come in his work clothes. No jacket, no Kevlar, no visible weapon. He walked through the chaos of his own men, dismantling Marchenko's in the way that water moves through a space, finding every available path with no wasted effort. His face was completely closed, the expression of a man operating from a place too deep for whatever lived on the surface. Marchenko reached for something at his waistband. Ravil crossed the room in 4 strides, and something was on the floor, and Marchenko's arm was behind his back at an angle that made Penny wince in sympathy despite everything. "Where is she?" Ravil said. It wasn't a question. "Here," Penny called from the chair. He looked up, found her. Something passed across his face that lasted less than a second, and then was gone. But she saw it, filed it, kept it. He crossed to her, crouched down. His hands found hers and he pulled a small blade from somewhere and cut the zip tie with one clean motion, and then his fingers were around her wrist, the sore one, turning it gently to examine it. "You identified the building," he said. "Old iron smell and the blue line." She flexed her fingers. "I grew up on the west side. Gennady was still 2 minutes out when you gave the location. I assumed you'd figure out the rest." She looked at him. "You did figure out the rest." He was still holding her wrist. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had that first night when she'd been on the floor, surrounded by broken glass, and had offered to pay for everything in installments. Like she was the realest thing in the room. "Penny Malone," he said quietly, like her name was a thing he was deciding to keep. "That's me. I owe you an explanation. You owe me $40 for an orchid, actually." Her voice had gone slightly unsteady. "The explanation is secondary." He made a sound that was almost, not quite, a laugh. His thumb moved once across her wrist, over the bruise forming there, with a gentleness that had no business existing in this building, in this man's hands. He stood, pulling her up with him, steady and unhurried. Behind them, Gennady was doing things with Marchenko that Penny decided not to look at directly. Pasha appeared at her elbow, with her bag and her phone, returned whole, which she thought said something about the degree to which Ravil Sorin had communicated the importance of this errand. "You should know what I am," Ravil said. They were standing close. The noise of the room seemed distant. "What this is?" "I've known for 6 weeks," Penny said. "I work up there every Wednesday. I'm not unobservant. I just try to keep the observing to myself. And you stayed. The money's good." A pause, and there was the cashmere throw. He looked at her steadily. "You deserve better than this world, probably." She met his eyes. "I also can't afford to be precious about it. I'm 26, I have outstanding debt, and my mum needs new dialysis equipment in March." She took a breath. "And I like Wednesday nights." The silence between them was the particular kind that means something has been decided, even if neither person is saying it yet. Ravil Sorin reached out and tucked a piece of hair behind her ear with 2 fingers, carefully, like she was something he didn't want to damage. "Then you'll keep Wednesday nights," he said. "And the other nights too. All of them. That sounds like a job offer. It's not a job offer. What is it?" "It's a permanent arrangement." His hand settled at her jaw, warm and deliberate. "If you'll have it." Penny thought about the dialysis machine. She thought about the diner on Wabash with its padlock and its handwritten note from the bank. She thought about 6 weeks of cashmere throws and chocolate squares and 40 minutes of conversation about pierogi and the way his voice had changed on the phone tonight, stripped bare for one unguarded second before he'd collected himself again. She thought about the orchid that had cost her $40 she didn't have and how she'd brought it anyway because she replaced what she broke, because that was the only way she knew how to move through a world that had always expected her to take up less space in it. "The orchid," she said, "plus damages. Name your price. I'm still calculating." She tilted her head up to look at him. "It might take a while." "I have time," Ravil said, and kissed her. It was nothing like the movies. It was warm and careful, and then not careful at all, his hand sliding to the back of her neck, her soft hands fisted in the front of his shirt, the cold air of the foundry and the distant sounds of Gennady's ongoing activities completely irrelevant, because something had finally aligned that had been tilted for 26 years. Gennady, who had witnessed many things in the service of Ravil Sorin and expected to witness many more, looked over his shoulder at them and looked back at his work and said nothing. But he did quietly tell Pasha to get the car warm, because the boss was going to want to take his time. The Voss Grand's 42nd floor did not change, exactly, but it shifted. The cashmere throw stayed. A second coffee cup appeared on the service station shelf. The men stopped moving around Penny and started moving around her, the geometry of the floor reorganizing itself with her at the center of it. She still knocked things over. She jammed the paper shredder twice in 1 week, which Gennady fixed both times with the focused energy of a man who had accepted this as his purpose. She spilled a full carafe of water on a visiting associate from Prague, who looked at her, looked at Ravil, and then laughed in the way that men laugh when they understand precisely what the situation is. Ravil bought her mother a dialysis machine in March. He didn't tell Penny. She found out when her mother called, breathless and overwhelmed, and Penny sat in the kitchen of the penthouse she was increasingly spending time in and said, "I'll explain later, Mom," and then cried very quietly into the cashmere throw while Gennady pretended with great concentration to be interested in something outside the window. She was not the woman anyone in Ravil Sorin's world had expected. She was 26 and soft-edged and perpetually at war with inanimate objects and the floor. She had not been built for this world's sharp lines and clean violence, and the specific kind of silence that meant something was about to happen. But she stayed, and the world slowly, with the grudging patience of something that knows when it's been rearranged, made room for her. Because Penny Malone didn't disappear when things got dangerous. She gave the address over the phone. She replaced what she broke. She showed up with a $40 orchid on a Tuesday morning because it was the right thing to do, and she had always, stubbornly, quietly, in the face of every reason not to, kept doing the right thing. And in a world built entirely from wrong ones, that turned out to be the most dangerous quality of all.